author of new book, Jeff Buckley, From Hallelujah to Last Goodbye. Dave managed Buckley in the 90s while he was still with us. How are you, Dave?
I'm great.
Yeah? Thanks for being with us. I really
love
appreciate
being in
it.
LA.
I loved reading about when you first met Jeff in the cafe.
Mm-hmm.
It was interesting to me how you two bonded over 80s metal. Is this just one of the things that you two had in common when hitting it off?
Well, I mean, it started off with metal because he saw my resume that, I was touring heavy metal bands in the 80s. I was the guy that they called the cleaner, the Mafia saying. I would come in and clean up the messes from all the decadence that life on the road had at that time. And but the real reason we bonded, we had a lot of similarities in the effect that he moved around a lot as a kid, so did I. Back then there wasn't the internet, and it was either long distance phone calls or writing letters, so we basically didn't have any close childhood friends. So we were both very much loners. And it was that sense that I think during that first trip that we took together that we bonded, because there has to be a trust element with the manager and the artist. And I think we got it then.
Right. And about trust, when managing Buckley and beginning to, were you able to fully trust him in his vision, since he was jumping back and forth between genres often?
Well, yeah, he was all over the place. He was talking Pakistani records he was going to do. He had those instruments in his house. He'd pick up a violin, never played it before, made it sound like so great. It was like, and he mimicked everything. If he met you in 5 minutes, he'd have you down with all your mannerisms. And the bus rides were so much fun overnight, because back then there was a show called Beavis and Butthead, and he would be Beavis and Butthead. Or he'd be James Brown and do the raps and the singing and perform the horns and all that stuff. So he's the only artist that I trusted 100%. And we had a saying, did you pack a parachute? Because he was always taking leaps off a cliff. No other artist I'd worked with ever did. And I'd say, do you have a parachute? And he goes, I think so. Because we never knew how hard the landing was going to be. So.
Right. And when writing the book, Jeff Buckley, From Hallelujah to Last Goodbye, you finally decided to write this after 19, 20 years?
Yeah, it started, somebody approached me about the movie, and I'd been approached to join the Estates movie as moms, and we don't exactly get along, so didn't back then. So I didn't want to participate in those. And I got a call from CAA, the talent agency, and they said, it's time for you to write the book. And I went out into the garage. My wife was his promotion manager in Europe. That's how we met. So every day I look at my wife and my daughters. I would not have had them today without Jeff. And I remember going out, opening up the box, and the first box was all the stuff on his death. And they wanted the death chapter first, and I sat on my back porch writing it for 3 days and couldn't stop crying. I realized at that point I hadn't grieved, and because I was taking care of everybody else around me. So it was difficult. And the other difficult part about writing a book, for those that want to plan on writing a book, is the work that it takes.
Yeah.
My co-writer Jim Urban was the editor at Mojo magazine in the UK when he disappeared, and happened to be in Ireland with me to see another artist. And I would write something and he would send back 30 pages, single space, what color was your shirt, what kind of car were you driving, what was the wallpaper like in the hotel, and you have to do your research.
Right. And it took you 2 years, right?
Took 2 years. A lot of it because of the research he did on it. It's interesting when you learn things about Buckley that I didn't even know. How he felt towards me, that he wanted to fire me one time. I try to be as honest in the book as possible, the good, the bad, the ugly, and also give a peek behind the artist-manager relationship and the stuff that you go through. I thought that would be more fascinating to a lot of people. Maybe they didn't know Jeff Buckley. But the main reason I wrote the book, I've read everything that's been written about him, and there's just a lot wrong with him. And I wanted to put a stamp on his legacy. So this tour that I'm doing in music venues is pretty unique, doing Q&As with the fans. And I want somebody to pick up his music 50 years from now and somebody go, here's the book that's the definitive Jeff Buckley. The best compliment I got was from Billboard magazine. The guy said, I've read everything about Buckley. And after I read your book, I didn't know anything about Buckley.
Right.
So, and that the other compliments that's regular is they feel they're with me. in the book, and that they feel the pain, they feel the anger, they feel all the things, the joys, everything we went through. So that's a pretty big compliment.
Yeah. And about the artist-manager relationship, could you go a little bit, can you expand on that? Because I assume it wasn't all business related.
Well, it's kind of like being married. You love each other, you fight, you have disagreements, you make up. But there has to be the trust factor that it got to the point with Jeff and I that if something came in for him to do, I would know automatically and didn't even have to check with him. And when I laid out the promo for him to do, or the shows to do, we were so locked in sync that he never questioned anything. That's one. So obviously the trust is there. But I knew I had his trust really the first week, but especially 2 years later. On the first trip, he was telling dumb jokes. And wasn't doing a set list, and he was getting upset about them calling out his dad's songs, Tim Buckley, the legendary folk artist. And I told him, I put in an Allman Brothers tape because I managed them. It was a live tape, and I said, when Keith Richards or Dickie Betts of the Allman Brothers puts on their guitar, it's like a gunslinger putting on their holster.
Yeah. And
you're going to learn something out here I can't teach you, and it's called attitude. They take the stage and they own it. They demand you listen to them. And also the Allman Brothers, their shows have highs and lows, and you're worn out by the time you get done listening to their show. Fast forward over 2 years later, he was very big internationally, Jeff was. He wasn't as big in America, but he was massive internationally. So we were doing the second of 2 sold-out shows at the Zenith in Paris, or the Olympia, I'm sorry. We was surfing the audience. They were ripping his shirt off. They put him back on the stage. He came running up a circle staircase, came running back down, and went, attitude. And I said, now you got it. Meaning he listened to something I told him over 2 years prior. So that meant a lot.
Speaking of attitude, you had said before that when you decide to work with a client, it's because you assume that they can sing or play guitar, but it's an it factor that when they light up into a room, like you said, that or when they walk into a room, they light it up. Is this related to attitude? That is something that you can teach a person, or is it more potential?
No, it's something that comes out. I always say artists have screws loose, and the more screws that are loose, the more talented they are. And I've managed some that had an old trash can full of loose screws. But they're artists. That's why they're artists, right? And they need somebody more grounded, like a manager, to kind of guide the ship. But yeah, and it was a college student that asked me. I was teaching in William Patterson, New Jersey, a music business grad program, and I got asked that question, and I had to think about it, and that's when I came up with that answer. But every artist that I've ever worked with, it's like the windows open up and the wind's blowing in, and there's just this star quality, and everything's in slow motion. It's just wild. And the first one that happened to me, believe it or not, was Tony Bennett. I was working at a record store in New York going to college. I wasn't a Tony Bennett fan, but the way he walked in, even if you didn't like their music, it was just like, oh my God, he's bigger than life.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Now, My Sweetheart the Drunk, it was incomplete before his passing.
Mm-hmm.
How close do you think sketches of My Sweetheart the Drunk was? How similar was it to what would have been the final
It
product?
would not have been.
No.
I mean, when he gave me that cassette, because that was a cassette back then, he said these aren't nearly close to being completed, and I'm going down with Andy Wallace, and we're going to put the color to them. An interesting thing that Steve Berkowitz, who was his A&R person at Columbia Records, said was that when they were doing Grace, Jeff said, can I have a pencil? And he erased the charts and wrote the charts for Grace. I mean, a lot of them. And Steve Berkowitz said, where did he learn to do that? So, from a musical standpoint, it would have just gotten more brighter. I mean, he wasn't going to do Grace 2, so it would have been different than that. I think there definitely were hits on that record. Jeff was a composer, he wasn't a songwriter, so it took him longer to write than most artists, because he's about, how's that going to sound? Like, how do you describe Sgt. Pepper's or, the Queen album, Not at the Opera, those are compositions. Those aren't writing songs.
Right.
And that's what Jeff would have done to those songs.
I had heard in one interview that he said that, and I quote, "It is bullshit to try to own the world when you're young, and that you don't actually explode until you're about 47. Jeff tragically passed before he was of that age, but do you think that he made it to what would have been a great amount of success for a 31-year-old in only a few years?
Yeah, I mean, he did. He touched a lot of people. He also, one of the things that's exciting about doing, this Q&A with the fans and then the book signing afterwards is I did one in New York, and a couple came up to me. They'd been married over 15 years, had 2 kids. They met on a Buckley online site.
Wow.
They were 5,000 miles away and got married. So that's when you know he really touched people.
Yeah, definitely. Now, there were definitely lots of covers of Hallelujah before Buckley, but his was, without a doubt, the most iconic. Were you surprised by his success?
No, I kind of knew it on the 3rd show we did together with him solo, because he put it last in the set. I was getting him to try a set list, give the ebbs and flows. And, at the beginning, people really didn't know about him. We were just setting up and playing, getting the tastemakers down there. And it was also the era of grunge, so, he was so different that we knew it. The 3rd, you could hear a feather drop. And that's when we both looked at each other and said, that's it. And what's really funny now, Andy Walsh, the producer of Grace, I spoke to a few weeks ago to see if he read the book. And he used to say everybody came to him because he did Nirvana's Nevermind. He said, now people come to me because of Buckley.
Wow.
Because you can put Jeff Buckley on today, and it sounds like it could come out today. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, because there is no style. And that's why when we did the album cover shoot, and he's wearing what we call his Judy Garland jacket, the silver one, he did that for 2 reasons. One was to get as far away from his father as possible, from an image standpoint. Because usually you see an album cover, you go, that's a metal band, that's a folk artist, or whatever, rap artist. And the second reason was he could go anywhere musically he wanted to go in the future because it didn't define him, that photo that was on the album cover.
Yeah. In your book, you mentioned that towards the end, his behavior became somewhat erratic. You mentioned that he had tried to buy a house that wasn't for sale and a car that wasn't for sale in Memphis. Why do you think this is?
Probably never know for sure. My guess is, from interviewing everybody and people that knew him closely, is he really wanted to settle down. Yeah. He came back to New York. He couldn't go to his St. John's. Too many people knew him. Wouldn't leave him alone. He just wanted to be a normal person. I mean, he applied to be a butterfly keeper at the zoo.
Really?
Yes.
In the midst of his career?
At the Memphis Zoo, yeah. So, we were all like, what's going on? And it's hard to say. I mean, he told Joan, his then-girlfriend, that he was suffering from depression. And there's anxiety with the second record because it took a long time. Mm-hmm. So I think he was just screaming for normalcy.
Yeah.
But I saw him 2 weeks before he died. He left my house. He was playing with my daughter, and he loved my wife. And he told me going out the door 2 things. One was, I got the rights for anything he ever did. If he did an interview with you, or if we did MTV or a radio show or anything, a photographer in the pit, I got commercial rights to everything. And we got masters of everything. So he brought me all the music up because he subletted his apartment. And he said, don't let Sony ever get this music. Mm. Second thing was, I used to discuss with him, it's okay to be popular. Pop music means popular. And Dylan's popular, and Springsteen's popular, and all these artists that you love are popular. Yeah. So he told me, I'm ready to be popular. And that's the part that hurts the most, because it seemed like when he left my house that he was okay with, the attention, that he had found peace within himself.
Yeah. You think before that conversation he kind of was fearful of becoming mainstream?
Well, we had it consistently over, the 4 years we worked together, nearly 4 years. Jeff turned down everything. I mean, we turned down tens of thousands of dollars for film syncs and TV tracks, and he was offered to star next to Barbra Streisand in a what was it, A Mirror with Two Faces. I felt like there's an old show called Happy Days, and there's a character in it named Fonzie, and he could not say I'm sorry. He'd go, I'm so. He couldn't get it out. And it was that way with me by saying no. It was like, any other client, I would have grabbed it. And, it's funny because Homicide wanted to use one of his songs. And I was going through all the faxes and stuff, and I saw like 5 faxes, and they started at about $15,000 for the use, and they went up to $50,000. And the agent kept writing on it, "Don't shoot the messenger," because I kept turning it down.
Oh yeah.
But we turned them all down. He wanted to do it one fan at a time. And there's very few artists you can just throw up on a stage and say, "Go sell yourself."
Yeah.
You could with Jeff.
Was this the last time that you spoke to Jeff when you had that conversation?
Mm-hmm.
You had mentioned that you attempted to call him 2 days before he disappeared. Was that right? Yeah,
and he never got back to me. When I came back from Memphis after he drowned, we hadn't found him yet, obviously, and he had left a message from my wife and daughter on the answer machine. Time-wise, it was probably about 15 minutes before he left the house that night. And it was just that he knew I was overseas with Cattell Kennick, who was another artist that I represented, and she's from Ireland, and he was best friends with her. And he just said, play the music, play it loud, love Jeff. I finally became at peace with everything. I was in a lawsuit with Sony because Jeff's last words were, "Don't let Sony ever have the music."
Right.
I knew they owned the music, but they were scrambling to put out whatever they could. I was fired a couple months after he died, and so was Steve Berkowitz, who was his A&R person, and Andy Waller's producer. Basically, anybody who had anything to do with his music were fired.
Lost their jobs.
Yeah, but it was kind of a relief because of the stuff we were witnessing. But my wife had a psychic outside London, and I'd never been to a psychic. I always pictured the neon psychic sign. It was this little old lady, an hour outside London, rural neighborhood, or urban neighborhood, rural neighborhood. And I had a bracelet Jeff gave me. I used to find on the road. It could be a venue floor in Sydney. It could be a hotel lobby in Paris, and he'd always lose it, and I'd find it. So he finally, after about 6 times of this happening, said, "You keep the bracelet." So she asked for a piece of jewelry. I gave it to her. This is before the internet, so she didn't know who I was. And she said, "There's a Jeff or a John trying to get a hold of you, and it has to do something with water." And I just kept nodding my head. And she would say things like that for the next hour that only Jeff and I would have known. And then at the end she said, "Is this his bracelet?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "I don't know if this makes sense, but he didn't mean for it to happen. He didn't fight it. It's not your fault, and it's okay to let everything go." And I went back to New York. I boxed everything up, took it up in like 3 cabs to Sony Music Messenger Center and dropped them off. And then 2 months later, I was working at Artemis Records. We had that little hit, "Who Let the Dogs Out?" You can blame me for that. But anyway, I was at the Christmas party, and when I walked out of I got my coat and was leaving it, there was a brisk wind came by, and then I saw a falling star, and I raised my hand to get a taxi, and the bracelet was gone. And that was about 6-7 years after his passing, and that's the first time I was able to listen to his music.
Do you listen to his music anymore often?
Not often. It's still, even you can tell talking about it now. Somebody asked me, why did it take so long for you and to get these others to talk? Because we all turned down everything for 21 years. I said, what if I told you your parents died in a horrific plane accident, and I wanted to go back and revisit it with you? And that's kind of why, most of the people that were in the book haven't read through it because they're afraid to. Like Chris Dowd at Fishbone is going to be at the show Sunday. I'm going to pull him up for the 3rd segment. And he told me it's still on his coffee table. He doesn't know if he can get through it. So, that's kind of why. It's tough. It's my wife hasn't read the book.
She isn't?
No.
She was close with Jeff, too?
Yeah, well, her job was to protect him from the media. So she was the one taking him in across Europe, across into TV shows, press junkets, keeping the press away from him, getting him out, without, telling him not to talk about Tim Buckley. He adored her.
Yeah, Jeff wasn't a fan of the press, right, and of critics.
Well, I wouldn't say he wasn't a fan. He just didn't care what they say. And if you're any artist, you got to have that mentality.
Yeah.
Because if you're thin-skinned,
they can tear you down.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. What would you say to people who haven't listened to Jeff's music or haven't listened to it in a long time? What's a specific song or album that stands out that you think is one of the best that they should get back on?
I'll start it twofold. The first one is the one that they should listen to isn't out, and that is What's in My Car. It is Live at the Wireless from his last Australian tour, second from last 2 tours were in Australia. It was 24-track recorded of a show. The band had been touring for nearly 3 years. It was a phenomenal live show, and Jeff mixed it and mastered it. And I have that in my car, and that's what I do listen to. It's kind of like my joke, because it says written by Jeff, performed by Jeff, sequenced by Jeff, produced by Jeff, mixed by Jeff, but most of all approved by Jeff. And he told me that was supposed to be his live album, and that's what I wanted to come out right away. But there's so many different things that they're putting out, both solo-wise, like the new box set for Live at Chennai, and there's so many outtakes that are going to come out. I think that with Jeff, well, for us guys, we used to say with Grace, give it to your girlfriend or your wife and say, honey, this is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
You're right. But Grace was way ahead of its time if you listen to it today, and knew it came out in 1994.
Yeah.
So, you can get a little bit out of everything because he has so many different styles.
Yeah.
But yeah, the live albums for me, because that's how we were building the career. That's what I remembered about him. He was happiest when he was on the stage. So that's kind of like how I can listen to him today.
Right. Now, what was it like losing an artist that you'd worked with? Because I know for even fans, it felt like they lost a person who they were close with and never met.
Well, thank God there wasn't Twitter and Facebook and everything else out at the time, because somebody said to me about reading the book that when I got the call, I dropped the phone. And it was at 5:58 in the morning in Ireland. And if you're in a hotel at 6 o'clock in the morning, it's very still, right? Mm-hmm. So Jim, my co-writer, Irvin, said, I heard the motor of the minibar click in. Now, how many times has somebody heard that? It showed the isolation. Yeah. But the best call I got was within the first day, and it was from Danny Goldberg. Danny and I co-managed the Allman Brothers together prior to that. And Danny was managing Kurt Cobain when Kurt killed himself. So Janet Billig, his day-to-day, Kurt's day-to-day person, helped me through the process, both of them. And Danny was just calling me every day to make sure I was okay, that I was taking care of myself, my family. Janet was giving me all the details about, getting DNA tests for paternity suits and all, stuff you don't even want to talk about.
Yeah.
And, but Danny gave me some good advice. He said, you're part of a club now you don't want to belong to. There's no book written of what to do when your dead rock star press darling dies suddenly. And he said, you'll get that call one day. And I did when Michael Hutchence hung himself. I got the call from Australia at 2 in the morning. Dave, what do I do? So there's no book written, that's for sure.
Yeah. How long was that after Jeff?
Probably 3 or 4 years. I can't remember exactly the time frame, but it was still pretty close.
Yeah, definitely.
Artists do. There was a wrath of them in the 70s when you look at Morrison and Janis Joplin, and those type artists, the Duane Allmans, either tragically one way or the other. But there hadn't been a lot since that time until Kurt, and then Jeff, and now there's a wave with Chris Cornell, etc. And Chris Dowd in the book says it best. He said, music is an effing blood sport. Mm-hmm. He listed all his friends he's lost.
No, Chris, this is from Fishbone. Was it Jeff Buckley's best friend?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Chris had never spoke before.
You and Chris?
No, Chris had never spoke to anybody about Jeff before. In fact, when I called up Chris to be in the book, he thought I hated him.
Really?
Because you asked a question about the manager. When I told you it was like a marriage, mm-hmm. and there's love, there's hate, there's best friends, but when you first meet an artist, you become their friend, you build their trust. But as time goes on and influences come in, be it drugs or whatever, you then become the dad. And I remember Jeff one time said, we don't go have a beer anymore. Well, he was drinking heavily, so I don't want to be seen supporting that habit. Right. So I would never drink around him, as an example. Same with a lot of artists that, did a lot of drugs that I managed. But Chris showed up on stage in London, and I came over, and when I'm backstage, I'm not, I'm there to do business. I'm not there to be buddies with, mm-hmm. People hanging out with my artists.
Right.
So that's why he thought I didn't like him. So we've become quite close now.
I think that the Jeff Buckley Hallelujah to Last Goodbye tour and the book itself is a great memorial for Jeff, and there definitely is love for Jeff traveling with you everywhere that you're going. So.
Yeah, somebody said, what are you going to do? I said, well, I'm finishing, I'm doing about 4 shows in August. I'm doing LA, San Francisco, already done the Northeast. I'm doing Austin, Nashville, Atlanta, Dallas. And then I go to the UK and Ireland in September, and Europe. And then I'm going to Australia in October. And I said, I'm going to get on the plane in Sydney to fly back, and I'm going to look up. I'm going to say, I hope I did you proud. And then I'm never talking about him again.
Yeah, it's kind of closure. Well, thank you so much for talking with us about it.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. Thanks for
No problem.
coming here.
Thanks.
Chief is dead.